Now, when we're here to consider the name just for profit, we're considering what is the social purpose of a company. The implication is that in our world today, the company has become narrow, more and more narrow. The company is no longer about the creation of jobs and the creation of wealth, no longer about many of the social purposes that we consider a company. The impression we get is that a company is narrowly focused on profit, focused on return for shareholder, focused on short-term versus long-term, focused on this at any cost, and that because large companies are doing this, and because so many different companies are doing this, and because the rules of the game is established by government reward certain things, the sense is that we inevitably, anybody who's in business has to inevitably function as if it's just for profit. And what I want to suggest today, and we'll see to what degree our panelists in our discussion, is business more? Can it be more? Should it be more? Or is it the case that for the future health of our society, it's making it more is actually not an option? My comments this morning come out of a book that I'm writing. The book is entitled Love in the Ruins. I pick really encouraging titles that really want to grab people. And the basic thesis of my book is that we've went from a world in which our world was structured in such a way that what we did, we understood that what we did ourselves impacted other people and mattered to other people, and that we didn't think of our activities as being completely independent of how they impact other people, and that we are part of a community, and that we have, in order for our community to succeed, every one of us has to work together to succeed in every enterprise, including business. And then that eroded, and we moved to a world in which we increasingly look at ourselves as individuals in a world with other individuals, and our job is to make it by ourselves. Our job is to look out after ourselves. If nobody looks out after us, nobody else will. That each and every one of us needs to pursue our own short-term self-interest. And there's this idea that if everybody pursues a short-term self-interest, the common good will somehow appear. And my thesis is that it's not working, and it won't work. So what is it that a politics professor might have to say to stimulate a conversation on these issues of business? Just for profit, the individual. Let me come out with a thesis. The thesis is that human life is inescapably relational. Human life is inescapably relational. We may conceive of ourselves as individuals, and that our job in life is to just function as individuals for our own short-term self-interest. We may think that a business, in a certain sense, is an extension of an individual. The business has a purpose of making a profit. The business has a purpose of its own short-term self-interest, and that it's about the individual, whether that's a person, a business. And my contention is that's not true. It won't work. It's never been that way. The reality is that in our world, we do not know a better way to create wealth than what we call the free enterprise system. In our world today, the business is so much more than just profit. The business employs, the business creates, the business puts forward products and ideas. The business is an engine that can move our society forward in so many different ways. I am able to stand here today because somebody created wealth in our society. And almost certainly that was done through business and the creation of jobs. And the reality is that the business has never been and is not today an enterprise that is just for profit. It has a huge, important, essential role. But I'd argue that the problem of our day is that when we think about business and economics and politics, we're thinking of just the self. This lesson that I'm trying to illustrate in these few minutes, and then my colleagues will come up and add things from economics and finance, and then we can have a discussion. This lesson was hammered home to me in the 1990s in my visits to Eastern Europe. After the wall fell, the Soviet Union fell, Eastern European countries had a problem. They didn't have anybody to teach politics. It was against the law to teach politics in those countries, and so when the wall fell, in order to teach democracy, they had to appeal to Marxist economics professors, and they weren't the best at teaching democracy. So a few of us were invited to go teach American government and democracy to students in Eastern Europe, and one of the things I discovered that I had never been aware of before is that democracy is not a set of rules, although they're rules. Democracy is not necessarily about elections. Democracy is fundamentally about trust. It's fundamentally about the ability to work together with other human beings to accomplish things for the common good. Because what I found in Eastern Europe, in Romania in particular, was that I could tell everybody all the rules about how democracy ought to work. And because the Marxist economics professors also didn't know how to teach capitalism, they're bringing me in to do capitalism and small business. This is scary. I don't take full responsibility for the state of the economy of the world, but anyway. The reality is that democracy functions, it can't function without trust. Capitalism can't function without trust. Capitalism can't function if people don't have faith that they will honor their contracts and honor their word. That the reality is that in the political world and the economic world, it is a world that is fundamentally relational, and it always has been. And that the reality is that if you live in a place in which there is no trust, it doesn't work. Examples? Alexis de Tocqueville said, democracy in America worked because people did the right thing when nobody was watching. Democracy in America worked because people did the right thing when nobody was watching. People that the Europeans believed could never run a business because they were illiterate and uneducated. They would come here and make hospitals, start businesses. They would come here and do things politically, economically, and in the business realm that they could never have done in Europe, and they exceeded the ability of many companies in Europe, but people who are much better educated. Tocqueville's point was Americans knew how to do the right thing when nobody was watching. Tocqueville's point is, and he said it in one phrase, America is great because America is good. If America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. Tocqueville said that because in business, people weren't in it just for themselves, but recognized that the strength of their business is connected to the strength of other businesses. The strength of their business is connected to the strength of the schools and the community. The strength of the business is connected to the moral fabric of the community. And that the reality is, as much as we may conceive of our lives as individuals, we may conceive of our business life as individuals, there will be no profit if we lose the social, relational, and economic social, relational, and moral fabric that's the foundation of our system. The crisis of our day is not the crisis of a few selfish people in business, a few selfish people in politics, a few selfish people in finance. I would say that the more fundamental issue of our day is that we've lost sight of the fact that it always has been, the success of our lives has always taken place in a moral context of community, a relational community. And that if that community, if that fabric dissolves, there are no rules and regulations that can put it all back together. Alan Greenspan was asked whether or not the new regulations that they put into place was going to solve the problem that they'd encountered in the financial crisis. Greenspan's response, and I paraphrase here to close, said the answer was he didn't know if the regulations would be good enough. He didn't realize that the selfish activity of one person or a few people could bring it all down. And that there was more to the health of a capitalist world, a business world, a political world, than rules and regulations. And one of the reasons I'm excited about this program is because that's what we get to deal with. So, Professor Romps, I want to invite you.
I've been teaching economics here at St. Anselm since the fall of '69. And that's a lot of time when you're talking and you're standing up in front of a class and you're saying to them in principles of microeconomics that in the long run, and you keep referring to these things. You keep saying you maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then you put in the emphasis that what we're talking about is not the idea of maximizing profits today, but maximizing profits for a long haul. And over the years of talking about that, I began to wonder. I began to wonder about the changes and whether I was really expressing myself correctly. That's what all the textbooks say. And then I began to think about, where the economics came from. And it was written back in, most of the economics, microeconomics that we use, was written in the late 18th and early 19th century. It starts with Adam Smith and continues up through the other classical economists. Most of it was written and agreed upon before the 1850s. Have things changed? What's changed? How are things different today? And obviously they're a lot different. And I began to wonder, well, who worries about the long run? Whoever thinks about the long run? And I began to question, and I began to think, well, where are we going? When my father worked for IBM his whole life, one of the heroes in our family were the Watsons. Thomas Watson started a business machines company that eventually became IBM, and he had a responsibility, and he took a long-run view because this was his family's fortune. He was looking down the road. So when the Depression came, he didn't lay people off. Now, they weren't selling a lot of business equipment, so he told people, look, you keep working. This is your wage. I will pay you what I can. If I can't pay you more, I owe you. All right? I owe you, and I will pay you back. And you can take it either in stock of the company or you can take it in wages in the future. Because he wanted to keep his labor force. He was thinking long run. I want this. I know this bad economic times will end. I'm not just trying to maximize profits in 1933. I'm thinking about what will be good for me in 1953, 1973. And he was succeeded by his son, and IBM was managed in that way. But IBM doesn't have any Watsons anymore. Obviously, Watsons probably own a lot of the IBM stock, but it's managed by people who are brought in. They're CEOs, they're CFOs who are brought in, and this is true for all corporations, that don't have any particular loyalty to that company. Their loyalty is to, as Dale just said, themselves. What's good for me? And the emphasis is, well, let's do things that will make me and look good, even if it maybe isn't in that long-run interest. Going back to economics, we had a concern in economics about the separation, when the corporation came in, the separation between ownership and control. J.D. Rockefeller controlled Standard Oil. Henry Ford controlled Ford Motors. The Watsons controlled IBM. But over time, as those people left, the control of the company was given to a diverse board, stockholders, the board of directors, and those people, their objective was not necessarily the same. So we always worried, would the directors of the company, all right, who weren't the owners were the stockholders, were they representing them? Were they working? And there was a lot of concern in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s about this separation as the corporation became the dominant form. How would that work? So then we came up with some bright ideas in economics. We said, all right, how can we make the people who function, who are running the company, the CEO, the CFO, how can we tie them to the stockholders who own the company? And we came up with the idea, we'll use options. We'll use stock options. The stockholders obviously want the stock to do well. If it does well, they profit. So let's get the CEO and the CFO and all the other executives tied to that, so if the stock does well, they will do well, which obviously is then in the interest of the stockholder. Well, that seemed to work for a while, and there was a lot of writing, a lot of literature that said this was the way to go. But it again took away from the long run and put the emphasis on the short run. Another thing that happened was that in the 1970s and 80s, more and more Americans, and I'm only talking about the United States right now, but more and more Americans became concerned about the stock market because they began to get 401ks. They began to get 403bs. They began to get plans where their employer put into a retirement plan a defined contribution instead of a defined benefit, and then they had to put their money in the stock market. So all of a sudden, ooh, everybody watched CNBC. All right, this was a new thing when that came along in the 80s and 90s. Everybody was interested in it. And then we made a whole bunch of heroes of analysts. Stock analysts became heroes because they would tell us who was going to do. And one of the things they were always concerned about, do you hit the numbers? Every quarter, do you hit the number? Jack Welch became famous, not because he was CEO of General Electric, but because he hit the number for 25 years in a row, every quarter. He would hit that number, and everybody would say, ooh, GE, buy GE. All the analysts would tell us, we're there. And the emphasis became not what was good for General Electric 30 years from now, but what was good for General Electric this quarter, because that was good for Jack Welch, that was good for the other executives, General Electric, and it would be good for the stockholders. But it might not be good for the employees, it might not even be good for the customers. We got away from that. The long run is what's essential. What's good, how it's there, how are we managing it? When you sit there and you say, all right, I'm doing this and I'm making this change because I want things to be better 20 years from now, then you're thinking about what your company is going to be like. You want to keep those customers happy. You want to keep those employees happy. You want all of that to be better. If all you're thinking about is the next 30 days or the next 90 days, then all of that disappears. You've got to cut costs. You've got to keep your prices up. You've got to keep your margins up. And that long run view disappears. I don't have a solution. I'm not even going to pretend that I do. We have deviated from what we accept. We're not doing what we teach anymore. Microeconomics is still the same. The textbooks are still the same. I could go back, when I took microeconomics in 1964. This part of economics has not changed. It's still there. It still says that capitalism is the best system. It still says that Adam Smith was right, that we should look and everybody should try to do what's best for themselves, and in trying to better themselves, they will better society. But that was based on the assumption that people were doing what was right for the long run. We no longer do that. Back in 1919, Henry Ford got into a dispute with the Dodge brothers. The Dodge brothers, before they set up, well, they were actually setting up their own company at the time, but they were also stockholders in Ford. And Henry Ford had a lot of profits. And he had kept reducing the price of the Model T. And he kept paying the workers more. So the profit margins went down. Now, they were making more profit because they sold more cars, but the profit margin per car was getting smaller. Ford wanted to use all these built-up profits to build a new plant so he could make the car even more efficiently. Now, Ford was the one who started the $5 a day wage, which was huge back then, much more than people were being paid. He more than tripled the average wage in the car industry when he did that. And he said, okay, I'm going to take these profits and I'm going to put them back into the company, and I am going to expand the company, expand the plant, be able to turn out more cars cheaper. I'll be able to hire more workers who will also get $5 a day. And this will be good. It'll be good for the customers. They'll be loyal to Ford. They'll be there. We'll have more employees. We'll be a bigger company. We'll be a stronger company. Well, the Dodge brothers sued, said you can't do that. You can't, you've got a responsibility to the stockholders. And the case eventually wound up in the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Michigan ruled with the Dodge brothers. Ford had to pay the dividends out. He was not allowed to make this decision on his own. He had to do what the board wanted, and the stockholders were represented there, and was there. Now, Ford later bought out all his stockholders so he could now do what he wanted to do and not have to worry about them. But the principle was set that the corporation functioned for the betterment of the stockholders. I don't even think that's happening today. I think that what's happening today is the short-run emphasis is only for those who are running the companies. What's best for them? How can I get that next job? How can I set myself up for, so if I'm CEO of a small corporation, how can I become CEO of a bigger corporation so I get more money? How can I become this? And so on, and then I can set myself up for good. The emphasis on doing what's right for the company, for the consumer, in the long run is lost. The emphasis is all short run. Thank you.
So I'll just give you a few additional thoughts to build on the foundation you've just heard being laid. The one fundamental thought I'd like to give you is that we have lots of concerns about how corporations are run, the power they have, executive pay, and so on. But we don't really understand what's going on until we understand how corporations came to exist. And this comes back to the invention or the creation of limited liability in the 1840s and 1850s in the US and the UK. Before that time, companies were run, their owners usually owned the stock or owned the company, but they had unlimited liability. That means that if the company borrowed, then the shareholders, the owners, were liable for all those debts. So that if there was a downturn and the company got into severe trouble, incurred debts, then the shareholders had to put in money to cover those debts. And so this led to tragic circumstances often. So you'd be a co-owner in a company, it was mismanaged, and all of a sudden you'd be personally bankrupt because you're on the hook for all those debts. And this was at a time when there wasn't really personal bankruptcy, so you're in debt for a long time, paying off the debts that a company had incurred with you as shareholder. So I understand that Sir Walter Scott's father was bankrupted in this way, and that was one reason why Walter Scott had to turn to writing novels to pay off his family debt. So we have some good literature as a result of this. But of course, this limited the willingness of shareholders to put in capital, to invest in companies, to incur large potential liability. If you were facing personal ruin, you weren't going to build a vast infrastructure, particularly around railways in the UK, if you could be on the hook for all those debts. And so there was a sort of legal concession made in the 1850s, first in the US, and then the UK had to follow because we were competing with New York at the time, that invented what we call limited liability. That means that a company could incur debt and would say that, would be given a legal privilege by the state, the government, and so on, to say that the debts of the company that the shareholders had to cover was limited to the capital they put in. That was, they could have their shares wiped out if the company went bust, but then the creditors had to absorb the loss. They couldn't pursue the shareholders. And of course, that sets up this separation of ownership and control that we've heard about. That, of course, you can then be a shareholder in a company, and it's more a financial issue. You don't have to necessarily be too closely involved in the management of the company because your downside is limited. You may lose your shareholding, but that's it. You're not going to be personally on the hook for the rest of the debts of the company. You don't have to worry about who else is a shareholder because, of course, when there was not limited liability, you would be quite happy to be in a company where there was deep pocket shareholders who would be pursued first for the debts of the company. And this allowed shares to be traded separately from oversight of the company. So this is why we have the stock market. You can buy a share in IBM or GE or whatever, and you know that I've got to pay whatever, $4, $5 for the share, and that's all I'm going to potentially lose. So if that company goes bankrupt, that's all my loss. I don't have to worry too much about the potential further downside. And so this is intended to encourage risk-taking by corporations and shareholders. This is designed to enable companies to raise a lot of share capital from shareholders who know that they can't be on the hook for all the losses that the company may incur, and that creditors are going to have to absorb those losses if the company declares bankruptcy. So this means that companies can raise capital, take risk, and start engaging in much larger projects as a result. And so this is the rationale for why this legal privilege is given. But it's worth noting that this is a sort of, every corporation is therefore the creation of the society it works in. Limited liability is a privilege and not a right. Because this has now been going for 150 years, we've got so used to it that corporations seem to think that they can exist without the need for accountability to the wider society, that they're there and they're sort of self-created legal personalities, and that therefore they have rights and freedoms that allow them to pursue profit at perhaps at whatever cost, so long as they obey the law, but they're not then accountable to the wider society. But we forget that the whole of the corporate structure is based on a privilege that society has given the corporation. So just as an outsider, it seems very strange to me that, say in 2010, the Supreme Court in the United States provided effectively free speech rights to the corporation, as well as other corporate bodies, so that they were allowed to evade or go around campaign finance regulation, because they were seen as independent individuals under the law, individual persons. And yet that seems very strange when their very existence is dependent on this legal privilege. So that's one thing that you always need to remember when thinking about what's going wrong with corporate greed or excess or size or power, that it's still rooted in this legal privilege. Now we then do something very strange. We don't just give companies, shareholders, protection from this risk, but we then give companies an incentive to borrow, because we then say corporate debt is tax privileged when we tax corporations. So they can set aside the interest they pay on their debt as a cost. They're not, that can be deducted from their profit. But often, I think the US has changed this somewhat a few years ago, but dividends and capital gains are taxed to the shareholders. And so if you look at the corporation as a whole, the tax system still privileges it if it borrows and penalizes it if it raises share capital. So we have this sort of bias within the system to encourage companies to borrow rather than raise equity. So when we then get concerned about the size of companies borrowing heavily, we have to remember that's a political choice. We have skewed the tax system that way. And so whenever an MBA student comes out of college and they're training, it's been drummed into them to say that debt finance is cheap, equity is expensive. There are other reasons why, but the main reason for that is the tax bias to debt. So we have these incentives that actually encourage companies to lever up, borrow as much as they can relative to the size of their capital base. And then we do something really stupid, and we allow banks to have limited liability as well. So what happens then is that a bank is often levered 30 or 40 times, even in the US under current regulation, even though that's been tightened up. So the sort of capital that a bank has to have is around 3% of the size of its balance sheet. So this means that a bank that is operating the payment system, this is the sort of utility that should be secure, should hold up under whatever circumstances. We then give the payment system to limited liability banks that lever themselves up 30 times. If there was no chance that a bank could ever be bailed out, if it was run like a hedge fund, the maximum leverage that a credit hedge fund would be allowed would be around 5 times, because the people who are lending to it know that they are going to lose money if things go wrong, if risks aren't managed. And so we have this situation where we give banks limited liability and the privilege to lever themselves up, and we give them the payment system to run. And then we're surprised that when things blow up, when things go wrong, the authorities, the Fed, the Treasury, whatever, FDIC, have to bail the system out, because we've given very strong incentives to the shareholders of those banks, to the owners and managers of those banks, to take risk, to enjoy large upside gains when things go well, but then we give them very little downside if things go badly. It is no surprise that financial systems get into trouble when we've skewed the incentives in such a way. This is made even worse by the fact that we allow banks then to get what we call too big to fail. So we have perhaps 6 institutions left in the US that are around $1.5 to $2 trillion in balance sheet size, and it would be virtually inconceivable for the authorities to allow any of those institutions to fail, to go into catastrophic bankruptcy, even though Dodd-Frank says that this would now be illegal. Rating agencies and creditors assume that that's not going to happen. There will be a way that is found to help out Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America, and so on, because they're just too big for the economy to allow to fail all of a sudden. We've also got a significant other problem in that finance seems to be protected from prosecution even when criminal acts are committed. So the irony is that in 2001, 2002, when we had the dot-com bubble and various corporate crimes were revealed, Enron, Tyco, and so on, CEOs, CFOs went to prison. There has not been a single criminal prosecution of anyone in a major financial institution for the things they did for those institutions. Yes, Mr. Madoff is in prison, for running a Ponzi scheme hedge fund. One or two insider traders have gone to prison. But in terms of those who constructed mortgage-backed securities that proved to be worth less than was claimed, any of those who have committed criminal or exploitative acts in terms of manipulating interest rate indices or whatever, no one has gone to prison. And so we seem to not just give big finance a pass in terms of the incentives we give them to take risk and profit from the upside, but we then give them legal immunity to prosecution for criminal acts. So we have a big problem, both not just in the US, but in the UK and Europe, because banks are still way too big for the rest of the society. And we can't face the prospect of applying the rules to them, because we would have to start breaking up institutions, literally, and saying, right, JP Morgan would have to be split into 4 or 5 different institutions in order to be small enough for any one of those to be allowed to fail on its own. So I'd just like to say that, yes, we've got an issue with corporations and the need for both trust and good governance to be applied at the top there, but that's sort of almost squared when it comes to finance. Have we got solutions to that? One solution may be to start tweaking limited liability for financial companies. So interestingly, when limited liability came into the UK, no one thought that you could even give a bank limited liability. That would be really stupid, because they'd just go out and take far too much risk. So initially, limited liability wasn't given to banks to prevent them taking too much risk. We then moved to a situation where there was double liability if you were a shareholder in a bank. That meant that if you were a stockholder in a bank and it failed, you had to put in more stock in order to bail it out, in order to sort of pay off the creditors and refloat the bank. So the stock price, interestingly, could have then gone negative because you've got a liability as a shareholder to help the bank out if it made loss. But that, unfortunately, sort of was watered down in 1925. So maybe one of the ways in which you start bringing in more shareholder control of risk in banks is to start saying, right, if you're a shareholder in a financial institution that has all these privileges, then maybe if it goes bad, you have to start putting more money in. You're bailing in the stockholders if there's insolvency. That would be one idea to start bringing in more oversight by shareholders of large financial institutions. But I'm happy to hear your ideas too. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are happy to hear your ideas. So we'd love to entertain questions and comments. It's often said that one of the things that us professors do at the university is to take the subjects that people are most interested in and talk about the things that aren't interesting. And so one of the redemptive things about a question and answer time is to get us reconnected with the things that matter most. We've got a microphone coming to you.
How much do you blame Obama for the lack of prosecutions?
I don't blame any individual. I think it's the system that we have set up, and it would be very difficult to prosecute Jamie Dimon, who is the head of JP Morgan, for the mistakes that were made at JP Morgan, or even some of the companies that JP Morgan acquired during the financial crisis. It's hard to prove in a criminal court. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that person did this, and that's hard when there's this separation of control and regulation. The government regulates. The government is supposed to be keeping these institutions safe. Obviously, the government did something wrong because it did not keep some of these institutions safe. It didn't make them obey all the regulations that existed, and it's hard to prosecute. So I wouldn't blame anybody. I think the problem is the way we've set up the system makes it hard to prosecute individuals. Could we have prosecuted lower individuals down, not the CEOs? Probably, but I don't know whether that would stop the problem. It might make people in the future a little more wary of doing something that they think their superiors want, but it's not going to change the people at the top, the face of the corporation, or any of that.
Shall I add a few things? I think I'd agree that the system makes it hard to prove criminal negligence and intent, but the authorities seem to be taking a sort of catch-all approach to try and punish the company through fines and compensation rather than pursue criminal charges. So I understand there's, just in terms of what the press reports, JP Morgan is at the moment trying to avoid criminal charges for manipulating the energy market in California and is trying to stop any of its employees being charged personally for that. They're wrapping it up with a big sort of settlement with Department of Justice, FHFA, and so on, for mortgage mis-selling and so on. And so the banks are being fined large amounts for mis-selling of mortgage-backed securities, for LIBOR manipulation. We've possibly got a probe into foreign currency manipulation coming, and so on. So they're willing to pay hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in fines, but they don't want personal liability. This is all ironic because this money is not going from them personally, it's going from shareholders. So the irony is not, you're not penalizing the shareholders who were in charge of the company at the time these acts were being performed. You're now just penalizing the shareholders who are currently holding these stocks. And so it seems a bizarre sort of corporate penalty approach that you're just taking money out of the balance sheet of current shareholders rather than pursuing previous ones. But this seems to be the only convenient way the authorities have found to get compensation or penalties imposed quickly.
First and foremost, I would like to thank all the panelists for coming out today. As a student, it's definitely most appreciated. You all kind of spoke to the increased self-interest of individuals in the corporate sector. What role, if any, would the panelists suggest that the degeneration of the American family and a sort of sense of entitlement play in the current state of the economy?
I'll take a stab at it. Again, we have talked about the fact that we live in a world that's very self-interested. A friend of mine said that there is no past, there is no future, we just live now in the present. And we're very focused on the present. And that each of us considers what is going to be best for me in the present. And the question is, can you have a capitalist system that works? Can you have a democratic system that works, that's utterly focused on the present, and in one sense, utterly focused on the self? Professor Romps was right when he talked about Adam Smith and the importance of each individual trying to maximize the good for themselves and the good for society resulting from that. But the reality is that Adam Smith, in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and other places, talks about the fact that capitalism can only exist in a moral framework. A moral framework, by its very definition, are kind of the rules by which we all live by, reasons why we would deny ourselves things for the good of everybody. That family matters, neighborhoods matter, communities matter. Capitalism can't function outside of these relational enterprises, these relational organizations, these relational groupings, and neither can democracy. Neither capitalism nor democracy was ever about individualism. It was about locating your freedom in the context of a community that had a common understanding of the good, and a community that taught each other the good, that observed the good, and that people would do the right thing when nobody was watching, responsible self-government. And if you're asking me, for instance, as the politics professor, and we can refer to the economists and the finance officers for other opinions, my sense is that capitalism works in a context. We lost sight of the context. We came to think that capitalism and democracy worked under a set of certain rules. Those rules don't work without that context. And so to recover what we've lost means requiring that relational, moral context. And it's a requirement, it's not optional. And in a day in which there's less agreement on what the good is, in a day in which we become more and more focused on the self, that's a challenge. But because I think it's the only way that works, I think there's hope. So that's how I'd answer it.
Don't worry about it? Okay, all right, thanks. Apropos of what you're talking about, the morality in a social context, my understanding of there have been studies done on the original individuals who started a lot of these companies, whether it was Carnegie or Walton or whomever. And most of the best companies had a moral basis. The individual who began the companies, their imprint from the top went all the way down through the company. And as these evolved out of the individuals and into the hired hands who become the professional managers, it then became less about the society and the relationship and more about making a buck. And when you look at the partnerships that became publicly held companies, Goldman Sachs, whatever, when the responsibility moved from the partners to the public, what was it about privatizing profits and socializing the losses? I'm just wondering whether there needs to be more talk about the modeling of how these things built up. You have obsessive people who have obsessed their way to the top, have had some good fortune along the way. But I think it's the same thing in politics. You have to be almost obsessive to want to become president or a senator. I think, was it Dewey, when they asked him what the cure for presidential fever was, he said it was embalming fluid. And I think somehow we have a lot of regulations. They're really not being observed in truth. And there's so much money going around to influence the Congress that there's always going to be a corruption unless you begin to get a change in the moral environment. And last night you were talking about an existential threat to the system, and it'd be a shame for the average person to have an existential threat have to happen, because it's probably going to destroy the system. So.
It's a lot of the discussion because of the financial crisis, a lot of it because so many of the investment banks were involved, with Bear Stearns going under and then Lehman Brothers falling and triggering the the height of the crisis. And there was a lot of talk about the fact that back in the 40s and 50s, these investment banks were partnerships. And as Paul had said, they had unlimited liability. They were partners. If their company did something wrong, they were all liable for anything that happened from the company because they were the partners who owned the company. In the 1970s and 80s, most of these companies, Goldman Sachs was the last, converted legally to corporations, partly to get that limited liability and also to allow them to expand their pool of resources for bringing in more money through equity without having to bring in more partners and give up their own control. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about that, and it had a difference. And if some of those investment banks had partners who were controlling the company and knew their own wealth was at risk instead of the wealth of others. Now, some of their wealth is at risk because they own some of the stock, but not all their wealth. They might have done different things. There might not have been the financial crisis. But we have to exist in a world in which they're going to use the law that's there. So if we have a law that says you can form a corporation and the corporation is safer for the individuals who run the company, then they're going to do that, and they're going to take advantage of that law. You're right about the moral context of a lot of companies that started up. As I pointed out, a lot of these companies, you know, the individual was in charge, and the individual would take a long view. And that was good, and we could live with that. I mean, there were a lot of things that we look on as unique or strange. IBM, for example, had country clubs for their employees. They would buy up land and put in pools or golf courses or whatever, and employees were members of the country club and could play golf for $5. They could go to a pool for 50 cents. And these were run. Why? Because IBM valued their employees and wanted them to stay. When IBM got in severe financial trouble in the early 90s, that was all gone. Now, that change was made not because of necessarily just a change at the top, but because of the circumstances. They now had competition that was much stronger than they had had before. And so it's an evolution. It's all these changes. A lot of people talk about Amazon today as a company that other companies should look at because they don't seem as interested in profits. But my view is Amazon is just as interested in profits as Standard Oil was, or as Goldman Sachs is. But what's different is the leadership of Amazon is looking at those profits down the road. And so they're looking at building up customer relationships. They're looking at doing things that make them more and more important in our everyday lives. They want us to buy our books from them. They want us to do our websites from them. They want us to buy our toys from them. They want us to rely upon them. So they're willing to sacrifice some short-run profits for the good of the company in the long run. But most companies do not have that view. Most companies look on and they're led by individuals who are trying to maximize their own value. As Dale said, capitalism works, but it works when everybody has a view that works in the best interest of everybody else. They can try to emphasize their own well-being, but within that, they're looking and they're trying to look and see what's good for the long run. How are we going to be better in the future? That makes customers better. That makes employees better. There's always been the fear that when we got to global capitalism, which is what we have now, that it was going to be a race to the bottom. It was going to be a competition to try to keep costs down so you could compete with the Germans or the Filipinos or the Japanese or the South Americans. How were you going to do that? It seems like what we've decided to do is we're going to do that by cutting costs, and you get that driven, the wages are driven down. But at the same time, the profits are going to, and through that option system and through the payment system, are going to the people who own the stock and run the companies. So there's a big divergence between the salary of the CEO and the salary of the average worker. And that divergence is getting greater and greater. So it's a whole, it's too complicated to say it's only because of one thing, but it's about all of those things. And we somehow have to set up a system, whether it be a regulatory system or a system that business somehow moves to. And it may be that we have to change the tax structure or the legal structure of some of these corporations and make them look different. I wouldn't be adverse, as Paul was talking about, to breaking up the banks that are too big to fail. Force them to break up. That would be very difficult to do politically, but it might make that particular problem a lot easier to solve in the long run. Maybe we have to change the laws about corporations. Maybe we have to change some of our tax laws. But none of these things are going to happen until we get a consensus of what's the right thing to do, and we get a consensus that this is the right thing for everybody and not just for a particular group.
I'll just add an example of, in the UK, where having a very strong corporate ethos works, and it may surprise you to hear that the most efficient retailer in the UK is a worker-owned cooperative, but it's been set up in a way that the workers don't have a great say in the management. So they are represented on the management, but they can't sell the corporation off. But they get a large profit-related bonus each year, depending on how well the company has done. And the partnership is explicitly about both customer service and treatment of workers. And so it's not, an external manager can't come in and change that ethos, but because it's there, and has been going now for 100 years, it's sort of ingrained in both the reputation of the company and how you get treated by the workforce when you go in. Ironically, of course, the workers have tried several times to sell the company off and cash out a big bonus for themselves, but the trust deeds of the company were carefully written so that that was actually not possible. Otherwise, short-termist thinking would have destroyed this company long ago.
Would that enlightened self-interest be considered a tipping point, as it were, to what's the minimum regulation or minimum rules necessary to achieve a maximum result? The result we're looking for is not this avaricious, selfish approach, which appears to be at the higher levels of larger corporations, where it's very diffuse responsibility, versus just the example you cited. Not that it's going to be replicated all over the place, but we've got to be pieces of that might be used as a tipping point.
I think we're going to let this be the last question. Is anything you all want to respond to or wrap up with?
You can think of changes in company law or how shares are traded or whatever that would encourage more longer-term thinking. So we would now have the technology easily to say the voting weight within a company can be determined by the length of ownership of the share. So that if you trade shares frequently, and US shares turn over, I think on average, once every 2 or 3 days, and with high frequency trading, there's a lot of trading that's going on sort of within seconds, buying and selling of shares, that the control of the company is weighted towards length of ownership. And so that would sort of encourage longer-term thinking by shareholders, because the longer they hold the share, the more control they have. Also, you could start thinking about bonus dividends for length of holding as well to encourage that. But to be frank, this is a very difficult thing to change through regulation. Dodd-Frank told the SEC to force every company in the US, I think, of a certain size, to publish what they pay executives. The SEC has been dragging its feet on that, even just to tell shareholders how much of their money is going to executives. Companies are very reluctant to do that in the main, and the SEC has still not forced them to do that. And some assiduous journalists have gone around and trying to compile those figures. So even there, just transparency hasn't been applied, even though it's in federal regulation.
Anything you want to add? I've
usually been a person who is less in favor of government regulation, because it seems to be that every time we come up with government regulations, smart people in the private world find ways to get around it and very often make the situation worse. But I think the changes that we can make can be, if we can agree on what to do, could be better if we just change the structure that seems, so if we have a tax structure that gives an incentive for people to turn over taxes and turn over shares quickly, and to put an emphasis upon, quarterly earnings so they can make a quick gain, maybe we should change it. I mean, maybe the capital gains laws, taxes should be extended so that you have to own stock for 2 or 3 years before you get a benefit from buying and selling your stock, instead of just for 1 year. And maybe that would mean that people who turn over shares after 2 years would still have to pay the regular tax rate. Maybe we should change some of the laws governing liability for financial institutions as far as corporations. I think those kind of regulations, taking out some of the maybe misunderstood impact of some of the changes that we've made over the last 50 years, would do a better job of forcing people to take a longer run view. But it's going to be a very, very difficult thing, and it's going to be almost impossible to get many of these changes done in the current political structure.
We're delighted that you came today. This is kind of our inaugural meeting of this group that's looking at this question of corporate governance, looking at this question of investor education, looking at this question of how does government, business, how do we all work together to try to create a society that creates the common good. I think that there's a sense among us that in the American system of capitalism and democracy, it's a remarkable system for the creation of wealth. It's done remarkable things. Just being in this room today, it's a remarkable place. And wealth has created so much of this. But the question we're asking is, how do we stay healthy moving forward? How do we create a society, an economy, a polity that's going to be able to be self-sustaining, that it's going to be able to promote the common good in business, etc., moving forward? What does that look like? We've just begun to think about these questions. John and I are senior fellows in this program, and we hope that today's meeting is kind of the beginning of a conversation. If this is something that you have interest in, something that you want to be involved with, something where you want to participate with us and others in thinking about these things, we welcome you. And all I can say is that, speaking for myself, we need your help. I come from a family that's not very well wired in this way. My dad was in a hi-fi sound store in the 60s, and he was the manager of the store, and he hired this kid named Dick one summer to come in and work. And after about a week, he had to fire Dick because Dick sat on the floor of the hi-fi sound store, and he just played with all the stuff. And when customers came in, he'd sit the customers down, and they'd play together with all the stuff. And my dad wasn't impressed with this, so he fired Dick. So next summer, Dick drops out of college. He comes to my dad, and he says, "You know, Mr. Kuehne, you were right. I wasn't very responsible. You were right to fire me, but I'm going to start my own hi-fi company, tech company. I want to invite you to be my primary investor." To which my dad said, "No way," and politely said, "No way." Dick went on to create a business called Best Buy. His name is Dick Schultz. One of the things that, if you've ever been to Best Buy, one of the things that's their hallmark is you get to play with the stuff. I'm not somebody who's good at seeing opportunity and seizing the day. My mom, I talked my brother out of buying Apple when it was at $14 a share. We need your help. We invite you to be part of this. This is a big deal. This really matters. Thanks for coming.